The auctioneer's gavel cracked like thunder against the wooden podium as Cornelius Whitmore pushed through the jeering crowd, his weathered hands clutching a leather pouch heavy with gold coins. The autumn wind of 1847 whipped through Millbrook's town square, but nothing could cool the fire burning in his chest as he watched two young women standing on the auction block, their eyes defiant despite the chains binding their wrists. "Sold to the gentleman in black," the auctioneer bellowed, pointing directly at Cornelius. Gasps rippled through the crowd. At 62, with silver hair and deep-set hazel eyes, Cornelius had earned his fortune through lumber mills and railroad investments, but he'd never been seen at a slave auction. The townspeople whispered among themselves, what could the old widower possibly want with two such beautiful women? The first woman, Valentina, stood tall despite her circumstances. Her raven-black hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her amber eyes held a fierce intelligence that seemed to pierce right through him. Beside her, Isadora trembled slightly, her copper curls catching the afternoon light, her emerald eyes wide with uncertainty but not broken. "Come along then," Cornelius said gruffly as the auctioneer's assistant unlocked their chains. He turned and walked toward his carriage without another word, leaving the women to follow or face the alternative buyers who were already eyeing them hungrily. Valentina grabbed Isadora's hand, and together they hurried after the mysterious old man. The crowd parted reluctantly, disappointed that their entertainment was ending so abruptly. As they climbed into his ornate carriage, Cornelius noticed how Valentina positioned herself protectively in front of Isadora. "You're not what I expected," she said, her voice carrying a slight Spanish accent. "And what did you expect?" Cornelius asked as he signaled his driver to move. "A monster," she replied without hesitation. The carriage lurched forward, and Cornelius studied both women carefully. Isadora finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Where are you taking us?" "To my estate. 3 miles north of town." He paused, then added, "You're free to leave whenever you choose." Both women stared at him in shock. "What?" Valentina whispered. Cornelius reached into his coat and withdrew 2 official-looking documents. "Your emancipation papers. I had my lawyer prepare them this morning." He handed one to each woman. "You're no longer property. You're free citizens." Isadora's hands shook as she read the document. Tears began streaming down her face. "I don't understand. Why would you?" "Because slavery is an abomination," Cornelius said firmly. "My late wife, God rest her soul, felt the same way. We always planned to do something about it, but—" His voice trailed off. Valentina's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What do you want in return? Men don't spend fortunes without expecting something back." "Nothing," Cornelius replied, "though I do have a proposition for you both if you're willing to listen." The carriage rounded a bend, revealing a magnificent 3-story mansion surrounded by golden maple trees. Smoke curled from multiple chimneys, and warm light glowed from every window. "What kind of proposition?" Isadora asked, still clutching her freedom papers. Cornelius smiled for the first time that day. "I'm offering you both employment. Honest work, fair wages, and a place to call home while you decide what you want to do with your new lives." He looked directly at both women. "No strings attached. You can leave tomorrow if you wish, or stay as long as you need." As the carriage pulled up to the front entrance, Valentina and Isadora exchanged glances. For the first time in years, they dared to hope. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful auction day, and Cornelius found himself looking forward to each morning in ways he hadn't since his wife Margaret's death 5 years earlier. The mansion, once echoing with loneliness, now buzzed with life and laughter. Valentina had proven herself invaluable in managing the household accounts. Her sharp mind for numbers rivaled any banker in town. She'd confided that her previous owner, a cruel plantation master in Georgia, had taught her to read and calculate so she could manage his books, never realizing he was giving her the tools for her eventual freedom. Isadora had transformed the neglected gardens into something magical. Her gentle hands coaxed life from soil that had been barren for years, and now roses bloomed alongside herbs that filled the kitchen with incredible aromas. She'd also taken over the cooking, preparing meals that made Cornelius remember why food could be a source of joy rather than mere sustenance. This particular morning, Cornelius found himself in the kitchen earlier than usual, drawn by the scent of fresh biscuits and coffee. Isadora stood at the stove, her copper hair pinned back, humming a melody he didn't recognize but found strangely comforting. "You're up early," she said without turning around, somehow sensing his presence. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, settling into a chair at the large wooden table. "These old bones don't need as much rest as they used to." Isadora laughed, a sound like silver bells. "You're not that old, Mr. Whitmore. My grandmother lived to 93 and was still tending her vegetable garden the day she passed. Please, call me Cornelius. We've been through this before." She turned to face him, her emerald eyes sparkling with mischief. "Very well, Cornelius, but only if you stop pretending you're ancient. 62 isn't old, it's distinguished." Before he could respond, Valentina swept into the kitchen, already dressed for the day in a practical brown dress that somehow made her look even more beautiful. "The morning post arrived," she announced, setting several letters on the table, "including one from your business partner in Boston." Cornelius reached for the letters, but his attention was caught by the easy way the two women moved around each other in the kitchen. Over the past weeks, he'd watched their friendship deepen into something that resembled sisterhood. They protected each other, supported each other, and had created a warm, welcoming atmosphere that filled every corner of his previously empty home. "There's also this," Valentina said, her voice suddenly serious. She placed a newspaper on the table, folded to reveal a particular article. "It's about the auction. About us." Cornelius read quickly, his jaw tightening with each line. The article painted him as either a fool or a man with sinister intentions, questioning why he would spend such a large sum only to free his purchases. Worse, it mentioned both women by name and described them in ways that made his blood boil. "They make it sound like we're your—" Isadora couldn't finish the sentence. "Mistresses," Valentina said bluntly. "The whole town thinks you bought us for your bed." Cornelius crumpled the newspaper in his fist. "I'm sorry. I never considered how this might affect your reputations." "Our reputations?" Valentina laughed bitterly. "We were slaves 3 weeks ago. We had no reputations to protect." "That's not true," Cornelius said firmly. "You're both remarkable women who deserve respect and dignity." Isadora sat down across from him, her expression thoughtful. "The problem isn't what people think of us. It's what they think of you. You've lived in this town your whole life. These, your neighbors, your business associates. I don't care what they think, but we do," Valentina said quietly, surprising them both. She sat down as well, her amber eyes serious. "You gave us our freedom, Cornelius. The least we can do is protect your good name." For several moments they sat in contemplative silence. Finally, Isadora spoke up. "What if we left, found positions somewhere else, maybe in the north where—" "No." The word came out more forcefully than Cornelius intended. Both women looked at him in surprise. "I mean, of course you're free to go wherever you choose, but I hope you won't leave because of gossip and small-minded people." Valentina studied his face carefully. "Why does it matter so much to you, whether we stay or go?" Cornelius felt heat rise in his cheeks. The truth was something he'd been trying to ignore for weeks. These two extraordinary women had awakened feelings in him he thought had died with Margaret. Not just desire, though he couldn't deny that existed, but something deeper. They'd brought joy and purpose back into his life. "Because," he said slowly, "this house hasn't felt like a home since my wife died. You've both changed that." The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, carried by a dust-covered rider whose horse was lathered with sweat from hard travel. Cornelius took the sealed envelope with growing unease. Urgent correspondence rarely brought good news. His fears were confirmed as he read. The letter was from his business associate in Savannah, warning that Augusto Mendoza, Valentina's former owner, was actively searching for her. The man claimed she'd stolen valuable jewelry before her sale and was demanding her return. Worse, he had the backing of federal marshals who were bound by law to return fugitive property. But the Emancipation Papers, Cornelius began. Won't matter if he can prove theft, interrupted Judge Harrison, whom Cornelius had summoned immediately. The elderly jurist sat heavily in the library's leather chair, his expression grim. I've seen cases like this before. They trump up charges to reclaim valuable slaves who were legally freed. Cornelius paced before the fireplace, his mind racing. How long do we have? Maybe a week, maybe less. Mendoza's hired bounty hunters. The library door opened, and both women entered. Their faces already showing they'd overheard. Valentina's amber eyes blazed with fury rather than fear. Let him come, she said defiantly. I stole nothing from that monster except my own dignity. The law won't see it that way, Judge Harrison said gently. Not with federal marshals involved. Isadora moved to stand beside Valentina, taking her hand. Then we run, tonight. Running will only make you look guilty, the judge replied. And they'll track you down eventually. Cornelius stopped pacing. An idea was forming. Dangerous, unconventional, but possibly their only hope. What if they weren't fugitives? He said slowly. What do you mean? Valentina asked. Federal law recognizes the property rights of a husband over his wife's previous debts and obligations. He looked directly at both women. If you were married, to me, Mendoza would have no legal claim. Married women fall under their husbands' protection. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Harrison raised his eyebrows. That's actually legally sound, but highly irregular. You can't be serious, Valentina whispered. I'm completely serious. Cornelius moved to kneel before both women, taking their hands in his weathered ones. I'm not asking for a real marriage, just a legal one, on paper only to protect you both. Both of us? Isadora's voice was barely audible. Why not? If we're going to create a legal fiction, we might as well be thorough about it. He looked up into their shocked faces. I know how this sounds, but I'd rather be branded a madman than let either of you be dragged back into slavery. Valentina pulled her hands free and began pacing herself. This is insane. You'd ruin yourself completely. The scandal would be worth it if it kept you safe. And what about us? Isadora asked quietly. What kind of life would that be? Living as your wives in name only. Cornelius stood, his expression serious. Whatever kind of life you wanted it to be. Nothing would have to change between us unless you wanted it to. The admission hung in the air. Over the past month, he'd felt the growing attraction between all three of them. The lingering glances, the accidental touches that lasted just a moment too long. The way conversation flowed so naturally that hours passed like minutes. There is precedent, Judge Harrison said thoughtfully. Polygamy isn't legal, of course, but there are ways to structure the paperwork. 2 separate marriages, performed simultaneously. Highly unusual, but not technically illegal if both parties consent. This is madness, Valentina repeated, but her voice had lost its certainty. Is it? Cornelius asked. Or is it the most sensible thing any of us could do? Isadora looked between him and Valentina, her emerald eyes bright with unshed. Ears, you'd really do this? Risk everything for us? I'd risk everything to keep you both free and safe, he said without hesitation. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began pattering against the windows. The approaching storm seemed to match the emotional tempest, swirling through the room. How long do we have to decide? Valentina asked. The ceremonies would need to happen tomorrow morning at the latest, Judge Harrison replied. Before Mendoza's people arrive. Then we'll decide tonight, Isadora said firmly. All of us, together. As if summoned by her words, lightning flashed outside, illuminating the library in stark white light. None of them knew it yet, but that storm would rage all night. and by morning everything would be different. The storm raged through the night as if nature itself was protesting the unconventional decision that had been made in the library's candle-lit warmth. By dawn, 3 lives would be forever intertwined in ways none of them had ever imagined. "Are you certain?" Cornelius asked for the 10th time as he adjusted his black suit coat. His hands trembled slightly, not from age but from the magnitude of what they were about to do. "We're certain," Valentina replied, though her voice carried a slight tremor. She wore Margaret's wedding dress, which Isadora had altered through the night. The ivory silk made her olive skin glow in the morning light, filtering through the mansion's tall windows. Isadora stood beside her in a dress of deep blue velvet that had belonged to Margaret's sister, another garment hastily modified to fit. Her copper curls had been pinned up with small white flowers from the conservatory, and despite the unusual circumstances, she looked radiantly beautiful. Judge Harrison waited in the parlor, having agreed to perform both ceremonies back-to-back. The witnesses, Cornelius's most trusted servants who had been sworn to secrecy, stood ready with the marriage certificates. "The bounty hunters were spotted at the inn," reported Marcus, Cornelius's groundskeeper, as he entered through the servants' door. "They're asking questions about 2 women matching your descriptions." "Then we're just in time," Judge Harrison said solemnly. "Shall we proceed?" What followed was perhaps the most unusual wedding ceremony in Millbrook's history. Valentina went first, her amber eyes never leaving Cornelius's face as she spoke vows that were legally binding, but emotionally complex. When he slipped Margaret's plain gold band onto her finger, she felt the weight of it like a promise she didn't yet understand. Then came Isadora's turn. As she repeated the same vows, her emerald eyes shimmered with tears that might have been joy, fear, or something else entirely. When Cornelius placed a second ring, his grandmother's delicate silver band on her finger, she felt a sense of belonging she'd never experienced before. "By the power vested in me by the state of Massachusetts, I now pronounce you husband and wives," Judge Harrison declared, then quickly corrected himself with a slight smile. "Legally speaking, of course, these are 2 separate marriages, but in the eyes of God and your hearts, you are now one family." Before anyone could process the full implications of what had just occurred, pounding came at the front door. "Cornelius." "Whitmore," a gruff voice shouted. "Federal marshals, open up!" "Upstairs, quickly," Cornelius whispered, but Valentina stepped forward instead. "No more running," she said firmly. "We face this together." Isadora moved to stand beside her, taking her hand. "Together," she agreed. Cornelius opened the door to find 3 men, 2 federal marshals in uniform and a third man whose expensive clothes and cold eyes marked him as Augusto Mendoza. "I'm here for my property," Mendoza announced without preamble. "The woman Valentina and whatever other slave accompanied her." "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Cornelius replied calmly. "There are no slaves on my property. Don't play games with me, old man. I know you bought them both at auction. Yes, I did, and I freed them both." Cornelius stepped aside to reveal both women standing in the parlor doorway. "May I present my wives, Mrs. Valentina Whitmore and Mrs. Isadora Whitmore." The silence that followed was profound. Mendoza's face turned purple with rage. "Wives. This is preposterous." Judge Harrison stepped forward, holding up the marriage certificates. "Legally, performed this morning, properly witnessed and recorded. These women are now Mrs. Whitmore's lawful wives and therefore under his protection and authority. But polygamy is not recognized by federal law, true," the judge acknowledged. "However, these are 2 separate legal marriages, highly unusual, but not illegal in Massachusetts provided all parties consented." One of the federal marshals examined the documents carefully. "The paperwork appears to be in order," he admitted reluctantly. Mendoza sputtered with fury. "She stole from me, jewelry worth hundreds of dollars." Valentina spoke for the first time, her voice clear and strong. "I stole nothing, Senor Mendoza. But even if I had, my husband's property is now my property, and my debts are now his debts. Isn't that how the law works?" The marshal nodded grimly. She's right. Any alleged crimes committed before the marriage would now fall under her husband's jurisdiction to resolve. This is madness, Mendoza shouted. This is the law, Cornelius said firmly. Now please remove yourselves from my property before I call the local sheriff to escort you out. As the three men departed, muttering among themselves about the strange ways of New Englanders, the newlyweds found themselves alone in the parlor, the weight of what they'd just done settling over them like a warm blanket. So, Valentina said finally, what happens now? Cornelius looked at both his wives, for that's what they were now, legally and in every way that mattered. Now we figure out how to be a family. 6 months into their unconventional marriage, the Whitmore household had settled into rhythms that surprised everyone, most of all themselves. What had begun as a desperate legal maneuver to protect two women from slavery had evolved into something none of them had expected: genuine happiness. The scandal had raged through Millbrook for weeks, but Cornelius's wealth and standing in the community gradually wore down most opposition. The fact that both women were obviously intelligent, well-mannered, and devoted to their husband helped silence many critics. Others were won over by Isadora's generous sharing of vegetables from her now famous gardens and Valentina's sharp business acumen, which had already increased Cornelius's lumber profits by 20%. Still, the most profound changes were happening within the walls of the mansion itself. "Good morning, husband," Isadora said softly, entering the breakfast room, where Cornelius sat reading correspondence. The formal address had become their gentle way of acknowledging the legal reality, while navigating the emotional complexity of their arrangement. "Good morning, dear wife," he replied, using the endearment that had developed naturally between them. He stood to pull out her chair, a courtesy he'd never abandoned despite their unusual circumstances. Valentina joined them moments later, her arms full of ledgers. "The railroad contracts arrived from Boston," she announced, settling into her own chair. "And I've been thinking about that expansion you mentioned." This was how their mornings usually began, with business, gardens, household matters, and comfortable conversation. But lately, Cornelius had noticed subtle changes. The way Isadora's hand would linger on his shoulder when she served his coffee. How Valentina's eyes would meet his across the room and hold just a moment longer than propriety suggested. The way both women had begun sitting closer to him during their evening reading sessions. "There's something I need to tell you both," Cornelius said, setting down his newspaper. "I've been thinking about our arrangement." Both women looked up, suddenly alert. "What about it?" Valentina asked carefully. "When we married, I promised that nothing would change unless you wanted it to." He took a deep breath. "The truth is, I find myself hoping that you might want it to change." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged with possibility. "Change how?" Isadora asked softly. Cornelius stood and moved to the window, looking out at the gardens Isadora had transformed. "I married Margaret when I was 25, he said quietly. "I loved her deeply, and I thought that kind of love came only once in a lifetime. But these past months with both of you," he turned back to face them, "I've fallen in love again, with both of you, completely and entirely." Valentina's amber eyes widened, but she didn't look surprised. "We know," she said simply. "You know?" Isadora smiled, that brilliant expression that had been lighting up his days since their first morning together. "Did you think we were blind? The way you look at us, the way you care for us, the way you've made us feel like we belong here, not just as protected women, but as beloved wives? And we've fallen in love with you too," Valentina added, her voice uncharacteristically tender. "Both of us." Cornelius felt his heart race. "Both of you?" "It's complicated," Isadora admitted. "We love you, but we also love each other, not just as sisters or friends, but—" She trailed off, blushing. "But as women who share not just a husband, but a heart," Valentina finished. Is that something you could accept?" Cornelius stared at them both, processing what they were telling him. In all his imaginings of how this conversation might go, He hadn't considered that his wives might have fallen in love with each other as well as with him. But as he watched them, the way Valentina reached for Isadora's hand, the way they looked at each other with the same tender expression they gave him, he realized it made perfect sense. "Could I accept it?" he repeated, moving back toward them. "I think it might be the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Relief flooded both women's faces. "Really?" Isadora whispered. "Really." He knelt beside their chairs, taking both their free hands in his. "I love you both. If you love each other too, then we truly are a family in every sense of the word." Valentina lifted his hand to her lips and kissed it gently. "Then maybe it's time we started acting like real wives instead of grateful house guests. What are you suggesting?" Cornelius asked, though his racing pulse suggested he already knew. Isadora's emerald eyes sparkled with mischief and desire. "We're suggesting, dear husband, that it's time this marriage became more than just a legal arrangement." As if summoned, by their words, the morning sun broke through the clouds outside, flooding the breakfast room with golden light. The three of them sat surrounded by that warm glow, hands intertwined, hearts finally open to the love they'd all been afraid to acknowledge. Their unconventional beginning was about to become an extraordinary love story. 1 year after their wedding, the Whitmore mansion buzzed with activity as the family prepared for their first anniversary celebration. The event had grown beyond their original plans. Half the county would be attending, drawn by curiosity, respect, or genuine affection for the unusual family that had become Millbrook's most talked-about residence. "Do you think people will ever stop staring?" Isadora asked as she arranged late autumn roses in crystal vases throughout the parlor. Her question was addressed to both her spouses, who were helping with preparations. "Let them stare," Valentina replied from where she stood, directing the hanging of garlands. "We've given them plenty to look at." Indeed they had. The past year had transformed all three of them in ways that were visible to anyone with eyes. Cornelius, once a solitary widower, now carried himself with the confidence of a man beloved by two remarkable women. His silver hair was always perfectly groomed now, his clothes tailored to perfection, and his smile, once rare, seemed permanently fixed on his features. Valentina had blossomed from a defensive, angry woman into someone radiant with contentment. Her business acumen had made the Whitmore enterprises the most profitable in the region. But more importantly, she'd found her place as the family's fierce protector and practical anchor. Isadora had transformed from a frightened girl into a woman of quiet strength and deep wisdom. Her gardens were now famous throughout New England, but her greatest achievement was the way she'd helped heal the emotional wounds all three of them had carried into their marriage. "I've been thinking," Cornelius said as he adjusted his cravat in the hallway mirror, "about what we've built here." "What about it?" Valentina asked, moving to straighten his collar with the casual intimacy that had developed between them all. "A year ago we married out of necessity, to protect you both from a terrible fate." He turned to include Isadora in the conversation. "But what we've created, it's something I never imagined possible." It was true. Their marriage had evolved into something that defied conventional description, but worked perfectly for them. They shared everything: conversations, laughter, responsibilities, and yes, affection and passion that had grown naturally from deep love and trust. The arrangement of their private life had settled into patterns that suited all three personalities. Cornelius's large bedroom had been redesigned to accommodate them all comfortably, though they also maintained private spaces for when solitude was needed. They took turns with household duties, business responsibilities, and social obligations, each contributing their unique strengths to their shared life. "The guests are beginning to arrive," announced Mrs. Peterson, their housekeeper, poking her head into the parlor. Through the windows they could see carriages arriving: the Adamses, the Cunninghams, Judge Harrison, and dozens of others who had gradually accepted the Whitmore's unconventional family structure. "Are you ready for this?" Cornelius asked his wives. "We faced down slave catchers and federal marshals," Valentina reminded him with a grin. I think we can handle a dinner party. Besides, Isadora added, slipping her arms through both theirs, we're not hiding anymore. We have nothing to be ashamed of. As they walked together toward the front door to greet their guests, Cornelius marveled at how right she was. In the beginning, their marriage had been about protection, about creating a legal shield against those who would harm the women he'd come to love. But it had become so much more. The evening that followed was a triumph. Guests who had come expecting to witness an awkward social experiment instead found themselves charmed by the obvious happiness and deep affection between the three spouses. Valentina's wit and intelligence impressed the men, while Isadora's grace and warmth won over the women. Cornelius presided over it all with the proud bearing of a man who knew himself blessed beyond measure. Later that night, after the last guest had departed and the servants had cleaned up, the three of them sat in the library before a crackling fire, still in their formal clothes but relaxed and content. Do you know what I'm most grateful for? Isadora asked, her head resting on Cornelius's shoulder while Valentina sat curled in the chair beside them. What's that, my dear? That we found each other. That day at the auction, I thought my life was ending. Instead, it was just beginning. Valentina looked up from the book she'd been pretending to read. I used to think love was weakness, that caring about someone gave them power to hurt you. She closed the book and set it aside. You both taught me that love is actually strength, the strength to be vulnerable, to trust, to hope. Cornelius kissed the top of Isadora's head, then extended his free hand to Valentina, who came to sit on the arm of his chair. I thought I knew what love was, he said. I thought it was something that came once and never again. But what we have, it's not replacing what I had with Margaret. It's something entirely new and wonderful. Different kinds of love for different times in our lives, Isadora agreed. But no less real, Valentina added. Outside, snow had begun to fall, the first of the season. Through the tall library windows, they could see it drifting down in the lamplight, covering the world in pristine white. What are you thinking about? Isadora asked, noticing Cornelius's contemplative expression. He smiled, that warm, genuine expression that still made both his wives' hearts flutter. I'm thinking about how perfect this moment is, how perfect our life together has become. He paused, then added quietly, and I'm thinking about the future. What about the future? Valentina asked. I'm thinking it's going to be even better than the past. 5 years had passed since that fateful auction day, and the Whitmore estate had become something extraordinary. Not just a home, but a haven that drew people from across New England who sought to witness the miracle of their unconventional family. The morning sun streamed through the nursery windows as Cornelius sat in the rocking chair, his 2-year-old son Gabriel sleeping peacefully in his arms. Across the room, Valentina nursed their infant daughter Isabella, while Isadora played with 4-year-old Margaret on the carpeted floor. The children bore the features of all 3 parents in various combinations. Gabriel had his father's thoughtful eyes and Valentina's dark hair, while little Margaret had inherited Isadora's copper curls and Cornelius's strong jaw. Isabella was still too young to show her final features, but she already displayed her mother Valentina's fierce determination, especially when it came to feeding time. Hard to believe we were worried about scandal, Valentina murmured, settling Isabella against her shoulder to burp her. Now half the county comes to us for advice on everything, from business to marriage to child-rearing. It was true. The Whitmores had become an unlikely source of wisdom for their community. Their lumber and railroad businesses thrived under Valentina's management, providing employment for dozens of families. Isadora's agricultural innovations had helped local farmers increase their yields, while her medicinal herb garden served anyone in need. Cornelius had used his influence and wealth to establish the first school in the county that admitted children regardless of their parents' race or social standing. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, called their housekeeper from the doorway. The morning visitors are here. This too had become routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday, the Whitmore home opened its doors to anyone seeking guidance, assistance, or simply hoping to witness their famous family harmony. Today's group included a young couple struggling with infertility, a widow seeking business advice, and 3 former slaves who had heard about the Freedom family and traveled from Virginia to see if the stories were true. "We'll be right down," Cornelius said softly, not wanting to wake Gabriel. "Could you have Cook prepare extra refreshments?" As they prepared to go downstairs, Isadora caught sight of herself in the nursery mirror and laughed. "Look at us," she said to her spouses. "5 years ago, I was a terrified girl on an auction block. Now I'm a mother, a businesswoman, and apparently some sort of counselor to half the Northeast." "You were never just a terrified girl," Valentina corrected, shifting Isabella to her other arm. "You were always brave. You just needed the right place to let that bravery flourish." Cornelius stood carefully, still holding Gabriel. At 67, he moved a bit more slowly than before, but his eyes were brighter and more alive than they'd ever been. "Shall we go show our visitors what real love looks like?" The parlor was soon filled with animated conversation. The young couple listened intently as the Whitmores shared their own struggles and triumphs. The widow took careful notes as Valentina explained investment strategies and business management. The 3 former slaves sat in amazed silence, tears streaming down their faces as they realized that the impossible could indeed become possible. "How do you do it?" asked one of the visitors, a young man whose wife sat beside him. "How do you make it work? 3 people sharing one marriage?" Cornelius looked at his wives, that familiar warm smile playing at his lips. "The same way any marriage works," he said, "with patience, communication, and the daily choice to put love above pride." "But surely there's jealousy," the young wife pressed. "Surely there are complications." Valentina laughed, the rich sound filling the room. "Of course there are complications. Any marriage has complications. But jealousy?" She looked at Isadora and Cornelius. "How can you be jealous of people who make your beloved so happy?" When Cornelius laughs at something Isadora has said, "It brings me joy because I love seeing him happy." When he and I work late on business matters, Isadora is delighted because she knows we're building security for all of us. "Love multiplies," Isadora added softly. "It doesn't divide. The more love you give away, the more you have." As the morning visitors departed, each carrying with them not just advice but hope, the family settled into their daily routines. Cornelius worked in his study, managing the various businesses and charitable enterprises they'd established. Valentina reviewed the books and planned new investments that would secure their children's futures. Isadora tended both her gardens and her family with equal devotion, somehow finding time for everything that mattered. That afternoon, as was their custom, they gathered in the conservatory for tea and conversation while the children napped. It was their sacred time, an hour each day when they reconnected as spouses and partners, sharing thoughts and dreams without the demands of business or parenting intruding. "I received a letter today," Cornelius said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "From the governor's office." Both women looked up with interest. "What does the governor want?" Valentina asked. "He wants to know if we'd consider establishing similar communities in other parts of the state. Apparently, our Millbrook experiment, as the newspapers have dubbed it, has caught the attention of progressive thinkers throughout New England." Isadora set down her teacup, her emerald eyes bright with excitement. "You mean help other families like ours?" "Not exactly like ours," Cornelius clarified, "but communities built on the principles we've discovered, that love comes in many forms, that families can be created by choice rather than just blood, that prosperity should be shared rather than hoarded, a network of communities where former slaves could find safety and opportunity," Valentina mused, "where unconventional families could thrive without persecution, where children could grow up believing that love is limitless rather than scarce." Isadora added. They sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, each imagining the possibilities. Finally, Cornelius spoke again. It would mean travel, months away from home, significant financial investment. But think of the people we could help, Valentina said. Think of the children who could grow up free and loved and secure. Think of the future we could help create, Isadora agreed. That evening, after the children were asleep and the household had settled into quiet, the three of them made their decision. They would accept the governor's request. They would use their wealth, influence, and hard-won wisdom to help create a better world. 10 years later, the Whitmore communities stretched from Massachusetts to Ohio. Dozens of towns and settlements where former slaves, unconventional families, and progressive thinkers had built new lives together. Each community reflected the principles the original Whitmore family had discovered: that love multiplies rather than divides, that prosperity shared is prosperity multiplied, and that true freedom means the right to create the family of your... Choosing Cornelius, now 77, had slowed considerably but remained sharp and engaged. Valentina, at 45, had become one of the most successful businesswomen in America. Her investment strategies studied at universities throughout the country. Isadora, at 42, was known throughout the agricultural world for her innovations in sustainable farming and medicinal herbs. Their children, 5 in all, had grown into remarkable young people who carried their parents' values into the next generation. Gabriel, now 12, showed every sign of inheriting his mother Valentina's head for business and his father's compassionate heart. Margaret, 14, had her mother Isadora's way with plants and her father's gift for bringing people together. The younger children, Isabella, 10, Cornelius Jr., 8, and little Esperanza, 6, each displayed their own unique combinations of talents and temperaments. On this particular autumn evening, as the first Whitmore family sat on their front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples they reflected on the journey that had brought them here. "Do you ever wonder," Isadora asked, "what would have happened if you hadn't come to that auction?" Cornelius reached for both his wife's hands, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "I try not to think about it," he said. "Some possibilities are too terrible to contemplate. I think we would have found each other, somehow," Valentina said with characteristic confidence. "Love like ours doesn't happen by accident. It's destiny. Or maybe," Isadora suggested with a smile, "we just proved that the best things in life happen when you're brave enough to follow your heart instead of convention." As if summoned by their words, Gabriel came running around the corner of the house, his face flushed with excitement. "Papa, Mama Valentina, Mama Isadora, come quickly. Margaret found baby rabbits in the garden and Isabella is trying to convince Cook to let her keep them all, and little Cornelius says we should start a rabbit farm." The three adults looked at each other and burst into laughter. The same rich, joyful sound that had filled their home for years and would continue to fill it for years to come. "Shall we go referee the rabbit negotiations?" Cornelius asked, rising, with the careful movements of a man who had lived fully and loved completely. "Together," Valentina said, taking his arm. "Always together," Isadora agreed, taking his other arm. As they walked into their home, their beautiful, chaotic, love-filled home, the last rays of sunlight illuminated the brass plaque beside their front door. It bore a simple inscription that had become the motto of all the Whitmore communities: "Love multiplies, hope endures, family chooses love." Behind them, the sun set on another day in their extraordinary life together. Ahead lay whatever challenges and joys tomorrow might bring, but they would face it all as they had faced everything else for the past 15 years. Together, united by a love that had begun as necessity and grown into something that changed not just their own lives, but the world around them. Their story had become legend, whispered by those who still believed in the impossible, and proclaimed by those who had learned that love, in all its forms, truly could conquer all. The old man who had bought 2 stunning women to free them had indeed ended up marrying them both, and in doing so, had discovered that the greatest freedom of all was the freedom to love without limits, to create family by choice rather than chance, and to build a legacy that would outlast any single lifetime. In the end, theirs was not just a love story, but a testament to the transformative power of compassion, courage, and the radical act of choosing love over fear. And in a world that often seemed determined to divide and diminish, they had proven that love, true love, always finds a way to multiply and flourish. Their legacy lived on in every Whitmore community, in every family they had helped create, and in every person who had learned from their example that the most extraordinary love stories often begin with the simplest act of human kindness, choosing to help someone else find freedom.